phone. So I'm just going to pretend that's not.
Yeah, that's it. That's why we've all sat on this side of the table.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about advisory boards. Do you know, or have you got a feel for how many SMEs currently have access to some form of advisory board? Feel for it. It's very, very low. I think it's about 6%, and that's based on, it's not what studies available, but the uptake is pretty low. And you know, to speculate on the reasons, probably a combination of time, lack of knowledge, and probably lack of access to individuals as well. So I'll talk through kind of some of the things to consider in terms of how to build a board. If a board is relevant, or an individual is relevant, because that's something else that really puts people off, this kind of board work. That's can be quite daunting, the thought of having to pull a board together and kind of manage that. You know, the time commitment, you know, is another thing really to consider and take into account in terms of how much of your time it's going to take, how much time you're asking from other people. And then the accessibility. I can definitely confirm there's a lot of people out there in the market with lots of very niche knowledge, and there a lot of people are trying to transition through into non-exec roles and more formal non-exec roles, and it's quite a difficult journey to go through. So certainly in my experience, the stuff I've done in the past, it's a great way for them to build their experience as well by working with small companies on a 4-on-4 basis. So to give you a little bit about my background, I've worked for the last 20 years. It sounds like a lot. In corporate finance, or accounting, corporate finance, so buying and selling companies, working with predominantly small and medium enterprises, but with also some large corporates on acquisition strategy. And then for the last 8 years, I worked for a private equity fund. I was their head of origination, so my focus was around identifying investments for the current funds and future funds. So I have quite a long tail in terms of the relationship period that I have with potential investee companies as part of that role. I also manage the advisory boards for both the funds, and so advisors who advise on the panel side. I also manage the non-exec network, which allows us to bring people into potential investee companies, and through that I've got to know some really experienced people, and saw that a lot of them are really focused on giving something back to small businesses, and that was one of the main drivers. Obviously, you know, to get for more progressive remuneration becomes you know, a factor as well. But actually, a lot of them just want to see smaller businesses progress too. So I thought it'd be useful just to clarify kind of how boards evolve over time. And here we're talking about more formal kind of boards of directors, and I guess just clarify the relationship between the investment terminology and just the kind of business progression terminology. So pre-seed in kind of investment speak is typically kind of startup phase, where you kind of you've got a concept that you're probably pre-revenue generation. And at that point, you've typically got a founder, you might have co-founders, but you've got quite a lean team, and it's becoming pretty lonely. And it can be difficult to know where to go to find those directors and whether to even kind of form a board at that point. If you are in the process of raising money or going through kind of an investment process, if you would raise pre-seed or seed money, say through angel investors, that might give you access to you know, a non-exec. You've developed a concept, you've established your route to market, you've generated some revenues and commercialising the products. If you raise money at that stage, it's more likely that you will then bring people into the board that can help you to kind of broaden the experience and knowledge within the market. If you're a business that hasn't raised money, you might also start thinking about it at this point as well, because you might be thinking about kind of how you access new markets. The board can also be populated by execs that come into the business too. So where we managed businesses, but I have seen quite a lot of owner-managed businesses that do decide to bring in a more formal board structure. Well, once you get to kind of the private equity stage, and then and then obviously further along in terms of IPO and all of those different structures, that's where you start to think of the board level around maturity, governance. You might start to think about some value creation. You might start to think about ESG, diversity on the board, then becomes a consideration. But as you can see, it often takes quite a long time, and there's often specific kind of reasons as to why a board might be enforced on a business by an investor as opposed to a management team deciding to take that step themselves. Again, I know quite a lot of businesses that when you get to the large level, particularly where the family owned, they don't really have a board structure, they don't really have a formal procedure that they follow in terms of regularity of meetings. And I guess to confirm, that can work for lots of businesses. In terms of not having that board structure, but there are quite a lot of benefits that are associated with having a more formal board structure, particularly when we get to kind of the right hand side of the slide in terms of being able to make decisions made and outcomes from the board to profitability of the business and results, and that really comes down to how effectively those boards are managed, but also I guess how well the communication are between the board and the company itself. So it still needs quite a lot of management. So I guess just to confirm the difference between a board of directors, so a formally appointed board of directors, and an advisory board, because there are some differences. Both of them really should be there to promote the success of the company. That should be kind of the overriding objective between the two. But whereas in the board of directors, there are the responsibilities of the directors are subject to company's house requirements. So this fiduciary duty, which is effectively look after the assets and businesses if they were your own. The decisions made at board level are binding. They have a responsibility to implement and oversee good corporate governance, and also to exercise independent judgment to not bring in conflicts of interest in, and make sure that they're being transparent in what they're doing. An advisory board, which is sometimes referred to as a shadow board, it can, in larger companies, they can also have a shadow board that sits alongside a formal kind of board of directors. It's really kind of an entry route into having advice into the business, and because there's no statutory duty, it can mean that there's more flexibility around how people can work for the business and how accessible those people are, because having the full fiduciary duty, it's quite a big time commitment, it's a legal responsibility, so there's an implication on the individual that's taking on that responsibility, whereas in the advisory board, it allows them to kind of get involved in the business on more of a flexible basis. It might be a bit more ad hoc, and their role is likely to be quite niche in terms of a specific niche area of focus. And most importantly, it is advice, so there's no binding decisions made off the back of that. It's still important that if you're working with any advisor as part of an advisory board, that they have their own insurance. They should have their own professional indemnity insurance, those types of things. They're still providing advice. That's all so, what can advisory boards bring? I mean, I guess the answer is kind of it's pretty much anything that you define as a need in business. But what's important is that you're quite clear about what the business needs, and that you can clearly articulate that. Because if you're going to bring an advisor into the business, you need to give them a decent brief around what it is you're looking for, and whether you want their area of focus to be really, really niche and a very limited scope, or whether you want them just to take a bit more of a general view. But just to give a few examples, access and specialist knowledge. So you might be in, a very particular kind of market area. So a couple of examples of kind of access and specialist knowledge and risk management. A couple of businesses I've worked with more recently. So there was an energy business that's subject to the changes that come into force based on net zero and the requirements of net zero. And that has quite a big implication for this energy business. And it will result in them needing to completely shift their model. And what they did was found and brought in an advisor who advises at government level around net zero transition, so that they've got a longer term visibility and they've got involvement and kind of knowledge of the consultation process that's going on. So what they can do is gradually over time kind of take into account that advice and have the visibility around what's going on from a consulting and consultation level, and it helps them to kind of evolve that over time. So as opposed to, you know, if they didn't have that knowledge, they'd have to wait for that information to be published and then they'd have to react, whereas it's allowing them to kind of really evolve the business over time. Another example of a business that's brought somebody in to give them specialist knowledge. So there was a law that came recently called the Tasha's Law, which is around food allergy, this is something I heard about. Again, a food business that's involved in selling, distributing packaged products, and there's quite a lot of implications around that the Tasha's Law that's come in around if something's packaged, how it needs to be labelled versus how it's not packaged, and as a result, a lot of food businesses are being impacted from a cost perspective, because if they do package something, it's then the risk around labelling it properly. If they don't package something, chances are the waste is going to be a lot higher. So again, that individual was involved in the business from quite an early stage to give them some insight to that and to help them to plan around how they could best sell their products and distribute their products after that law comes into force. I mean, another great reason to have an advisor on board, particularly if you're a branded business. It's just a positive advocate, particularly if it's someone who's really well respected in the industry. There's quite a lot of examples of people bringing on, you know, great PR people as advisors. Even if they're very early stage businesses, they've got a brand and they've, you know, got a real clear mission. Bringing the PR type individual in as a positive advocate, it's just going to go and spread the message and talk really positively about the business and what it's doing and have quite a significant impact. And then, you know, the strategic exit permanent planning, that's something that a business is thinking about. You know, the lead time to planning for an exit can be sort of 18 months to 2 years. So having somebody on board over that period of time to help them look at, you know, what transactions are going on in the market, how can they kind of pivot and move their business towards, you know, how some of those businesses that have gone through successful sales have structured themselves. That can be quite a useful exercise to go through, and gives, I guess, a lot more certainty around the opportunities for exit, as opposed to, you know, I'm just going to sell my business, put it on the market, see what happens. You're a lot more control of the process if you do that. So, I guess in terms of how to identify and attract advisors, you know, based on the last slide that I talked about, the important thing is just to be really clear about what you want, what kind of experience you're looking for, what's missing in the business. So it might be that you are a very new team and you're missing some really niche knowledge, but you don't have the capacity to recruit somebody into a full-time role. So it could even just be a functional extension. It might be a HR person, it might be more kind of structure in kind of technical research area of the business. But if that is the case, it's being really clear about kind of who that person is, so that when you start to ask your wider network, they're really clear about what we're asking for on your behalf. Quite a common mistake, I think, in really early stage businesses, in terms of who you bring on board, is people who have known them for a long time, who are you know, big champions of the business, but are not necessarily going to challenge them. You know, they're just going to back up everything that they can actually be looking for. If someone who's going to feel a bit comfortable. So, you know, the word critical friends, not fans. You know, cheerleaders are great, but you need a cheerleader who's going to turn around and tell you that what you just did didn't work right, or didn't sound right, or, you know, it's just not structured in the right way. So I think it's really important to make sure the person who you're bringing in is able to be objective enough that they can give you some really honest and valuable kind of input, and that they've also got enough of an opinion. You know, they've got enough knowledge to give that kind of opinion in terms of how you can pivot and kind of move the business forward. Successful entrepreneurs are always really good hires, and I actually don't think they're approached enough. And most of them are really flattered. And if nothing else, you know, a conversation is always going to be worthwhile. You know, if you were to approach somebody directly and say, look, you know, in your industry, I've seen what you just did, really impressed by it, can we have a conversation? I would say 9 times out of 10, they'll probably have a conversation because they want to see another business and support another business that's going through the same journey they just experienced and help them to benefit from their learnings. And it might be that over time that evolves into a relationship. If not, then you've got another positive advocate for the business that maybe is out there thinking about the people that can join on board. So, you know, I would say the key in all of this is kind of just to ask, you know, see how many people you've got in your immediate network. And that includes people like accountants. You know, you might look at your accountant and think they're going to be able to help me, but if you think about how many of the relationships they have, same with financial advisors as well. Financial advisors have lots of wealthy clients, typically they'll solve their own business too. So I think once you've got the kind of brief around who you're looking for, it's then going out to all of these people within your network and saying, this is the type of person I'm looking for. Recruiters as well, you know. Industry influencers, so Hans got a picture of Einstein there, so, you know, I'm not talking about someone who's going to take a picture of food, but I think people who, as I was referring to earlier, people who are thought leaders in a space, who really understand the market, who are really ahead of kind of thought leadership around what's going on from a regulatory perspective or what's going on in terms of trends in markets, for example. You know, they might be slightly harder to bring on board, but again, you know, identifying individuals like that who, say, through social media or through the news or through you know, industry kind of market knowledge are quite vocal. You know, even if they're kind of very aspirational people, finding a way to get through to them and seeing if they can kind of lend to their experience is quite a useful way too. And I think that you know, the first one there in terms of help content, the key thing is just make it when you are looking and start asking the question. You know, might take a few weeks, might take a few months, but gradually over time you start having some really interesting conversations with people. And you know, out of that you might actually also create some interest from potential angels as well. So it might solve some problems around investment at the same time. So how much to pay is always a really interesting topical debate. And it's not, you know, there's no kind of one silver bullet in terms of how to make a decision on who to pay and how much to pay them and when to pay them as well. I might be being a bit unfair by putting, you remember the graphic from a couple of slides earlier, by putting the private equity in the top left, because, you know, I'm sure there's a huge amount of impact when you get to a private equity board, but you typically, you know, you spend a lot more on those boards, and actually the impact from one day to the next probably reduces over time. So I'll talk about board effectiveness next, but you know, high time commitment, high cost, but possibly a bit less impact. Whereas when you talk about the kind of founder at the really early stage, impact is so high when you bring, you know, an advisor into the business. But of course, you don't really have the funds to pay, certainly not in hard cash, and also you're not likely to get a huge amount of their time. So it's really, really important to agree on the basis that they're going to be comfortable with. Some board advisors will lend their time for free, you know, on a very, very limited time basis. Chances are probably want that to evolve into some kind of paid basis. And I did quite a lot of research around typical payments and typical equity structures as well, because it is quite common for board advisors at a really early stage to take sweat equity instead of cash. And there's a few kind of things to really think about to make sure that you're sort of considered in terms of discussions with those board advisors if you are going to use equity. From the research that I did, and kind of and you know what I've seen in the past, a range between 0.5% and 2% is relatively common. Might be higher if they're adding a huge amount of value. It comes down to negotiation, but that's a range relatively typical, particularly if you're not paying them anything at all. Key things to think about there is when the equity vests. So some businesses get caught out by savvy advisors that negotiate themselves an equity position that vests within a certain time frame. Now, small businesses, everything takes longer than you think it's going to take. You've got to be really careful that those equity, that equity doesn't vest before that advisor's been able to add value. Because you don't want an advisor sat there that's not really adding any value, or an individual with an equity stake sat there that's not adding any value. I would say it's more normal for equity on exit, because what you're looking for is a long-term relationship, a long-term fit from that advisor. And even if they don't take a long-term role with the business, you give them some value for the input and the guidance that they've given out at the stage. So that's a more common factor. And then as you move up the value chain in terms of Series A, Series A plus, and private equity, you move then into more of a paid position. So I'd say day rates for advisors, anything from £1,000 upwards. But if you're working with somebody over a long-term period, you could probably negotiate with them to get more time for that, or or to give them a split between equity. And really it comes down to how much value you think that individual is going to add, bring to your business, and how much they can demonstrate as adding. Certainly the way I work with businesses is I don't look to take any kind of equity until I've worked with them over a 6 to 12 month period, because you want to know both sides, that one, you can have the value, and two, it's a business that you want to have a long-term equity position in, and then it's the right thing for them to do as well. So if somebody's coming in and saying that's the position you want to work on, and you've got no prior experience with them and they're not really adding their value, you'll be a bit concerned about it. You're probably going to need it sort of 3 to 6 months, something like that, and then have that discussion. But have an open discussion about it. This is the basis that we're talking about, but let's see how it's work over time. And if there is a genuine reason for them to be remunerated because they're spending a huge amount of time, then it just comes down to common sense and kind of what's fair as well. But it's quite an interesting conversation to have, and you can generally tell how much commitment that individual has to the business based on kind of where they position themselves on that graphic set of payment. So I guess in terms of the things to think about is, as I said before, don't be put off by the term board. You could just be talking about one person. It might just be one individual that brings the business that gives you some support. But if you do decide to form a board, even if that's just with the exec plus that board advisor, there's a few things to consider in terms of how to create a high-performing board. And that doesn't mean to say that you need to get to private equity and board meetings where it's 3 hours every month, and a ton of work to compare the KPI pack, but it's just respecting the fact that everybody's spending the time at the board meetings. You need to make sure you're going to get absolutely everything you want out of it, and you also need to make sure you're going to get total value out of the advisor's time you're bringing into the business. So, appointing the chair doesn't need to be an external person, it's just appointing one per person that's in that meeting that's going to set the agenda, that's going to keep everyone to time, that's going to make sure everybody has a voice as well, and that everybody's heard, that you can have, quite abstract discussions, and that nobody's going to be laughed out of the room for that, because, new ideas and innovation comes out of having kind of what-if discussions. I think it's really important for any meeting, whether it's a board meeting or not, just to clarify what's the purpose of what we're doing here today, what we're trying to achieve with forming this board, what we're trying to achieve with bringing this group of people together, and is everybody clear about what their role is in that? And it's even more important when bringing an external advisor in. They should really be proactive about trying to determine and define what their own objectives are. But if you're clear about what you're trying to achieve from a company level, you can then sort of disseminate that out against the individuals that sit around the table. And doing that kind of allows you to track through progress over time as well. So if you start to document that, chair's documenting that, you've got somebody that's just write even if it's 5 bullet points after a meeting and clarifying the actions, you'll be able to track over time how useful this process is and whether it's something you continue to do. And chances are it will be. Once you start getting some traction, you start getting some outcomes from that, you'll see that it's worthwhile. I think the other thing is if you bring a number of different advisors in, particularly if you go in businesses that are going through regulatory changes and stuff like that, they might bring quite a broad range of advisors in. If it's not working, then rotate it. If someone's not adding value or it's just not relevant anymore, they might come in for a 6 month period and I think they came in to focus on. it's just not an issue anymore, then rotate it. You know, don't all sit in the room together if you're not really sure whether or what the point of it is anymore. So that's definitely, I guess, one of the big benefits of advisory board, is the ability to rotate that, keep it really fresh. And it might be that you keep some of those other advisors retained, keep them involved in the business, but they don't have to come to every board. You just bring them in at different points in time, and that's why it's so important to keep going back to kind of clarify the purpose and the remit. You might do that over a year. You might do that for every individual meeting, every individual board meeting. Say, okay, what we focus on this month? Who do we need to attend that meeting? Let's not just assume that everybody needs to be there. Let's bring the most relevant people into that. The time commitments is so important. I approach by quite a lot of early stage businesses that want advisory board members, for free. And I think where that becomes an issue is if they say it's going to be an hour, it's an hour's call, and then it turns into, an hour and another 2 hours of calls over the course of the month. And then when you have those meetings with them, it turns into a three-hour meeting. And it just kind of creates a bit of that feeling, because what you signed up to isn't actually what's happening. I think it's really important to honour those time commitments. And if there's a realisation that more time is needed, then go back to the drawing board and kind of reconsider what the basis is that you're working with them on, because it obviously needs to have more value for people at the time. So just respect that. The diversity of thought piece, as I alluded to the chairperson, it's about not just kind of giving everybody a voice, but making sure that people who have sat around the table making decisions are reflective of your end consumer. If you've got, a female-focused product and your board is all male, chances are they're not going to be that connected to the consumer. So equally, if your consumer is young and you don't have anybody at that kind of age demographic on your board, then bring somebody in. Because what you need is somebody that can really give a view and give insight into what your consumer is seeing. And so diversity covers, gender, race, age, it's and kind of social standing as well. It's really important to look at that and make sure that you're not making decisions based on your own blinkered view. It's really easy to do. There's a great book which you might have heard of by Matthew Sire called Rebel Ideas, and he talks about rebels versus clones. And that's really what you want in boardrooms. You want a load of rebels. A lot of people who are very different to one another that can bring real diversity of thought, and allow you to get a much better understanding of the existing customer, but how that customer might evolve over time, and how you can kind of reflect that in terms of the decisions that you make going forwards. We talked already about the kind of advisor-specific objectives, and making sure they really understand where they're expected to add value. I think it's also important to give them the latitude to, and the permission to be inquisitive about other areas of the business that might not have been identified as their experience and their knowledge being relevant to, but as they get to know the business over time, actually they can add a lot more value in other areas that you might not have defined. So by all means set and absolutely do set specific objectives, but keep checking back to those to see if they're still relevant, so you can add anything else to it. If there is a formal board, just make sure you can review it. So when we're talking about issue notes after a meeting, if it's just a few bullet points, go back every 6 months and say, what did we get out of that? Have we actually followed up on the actions? It's so easy not to do that. So if you're not following up on the actions and you meet every month, meet every quarter, just give yourself enough time to meet those actions and make sure that the time you're spending is really effective and that you are getting the value out of the different people's time and experience you've brought in. And just be really flexible about how you go about doing that. It doesn't need to be a monthly board, it doesn't need to be a quarterly board. If it's a 6 monthly board, you get a lot of value out of it. And do that, you sort of do whatever fits for the business, whatever fits for that particular time and climate. So I just thought, before I ask questions, to sort of confirm sort of how I fit into what I'm talking about today. So I tend to work with businesses before they raise money. The focus is all around stakeholder management. So it's before they raise money. typically not when they're desperate to raise money, because you just don't have the time to build relationships with investors. And the whole focus of what I do is about building relationships over time with the right investors that can bring the right value into the business. And you're giving those investors the time to get to know the business and understand their kind of their perspective on risk of the business, and it gives them the opportunity to feed back to the business, and for the business to almost be coached around some of the areas that we need to improve on. That's a great way to demonstrate to investors that you're investing in the team as well, because you're taking on feedback, you're making changes and going back, and that gives us some really good insight into how you are going to operate as a investing team. Post-investment, so a lot of businesses really struggle with that transition around, kind of free of them, having anyone to report to, don't have any stakeholders, and then all of a sudden you've got an investor on board. Typically, they're really supportive. Unfortunately, management teams sometimes see investors as adversaries, and actually, they're very supportive a lot of the time. They want to help, it's in their interests to work collaboratively. So that's what I tend to get involved in, is either where the relationship is broken down, or where it's a new team getting used to having those stakeholder kind of management considerations, helping them to build the board pack, helping them to define what the KPIs are, and helping them to think about longer-term planning stuff like exit. Board effectiveness that we talked about today. So, is the reward? What kind of information do you produce? Are you getting anything out of the board? Does everybody buy into it? And the need for it? And then finally, kind of the exit planning piece. So, as I said before, that could be anything from 18 to 24 months in terms of the period it takes to get the business ready. And that's not necessarily really involved detailed work. It's more about looking strategically at what are the transactions that are going on, and how could the business evolve over time, to give them more options around exit when you make that decision. Also around kind of facilitating introductions to specialists, advisors, people who might help to facilitate that transaction as well, give them more information at the time. Any questions?
I come across this all the time. What we find is that early stage founders with the funding, it's family and friends and things like that, and you usually come across, it's usually like a semi-retired or retired family friend who could be at a corporate bank, and they absolutely love it, because they've got a lot of time in hand and they help, and they're doing it for the right reasons. But we find that when it gets to that point, there needs to be an exit strategy for them, because they actually do want to retire, and then new board members come in. So it's interesting seeing that, because we see it literally. It's a big topic.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I think the question I'm trying to ask is, how would you kind of, you've got family and friends, you've got a consultancy basis, retired corporate banker, and how do you kind of veer them out and then bring a new board member in, or would he just be kind of a part-time board member?
I think it's about thinking outside the box slightly as well, because there is this, unfortunately, the kind of the typical vision of a NED is male permanent sale. They're right at the end of the career. They generally will add a lot of value, but to a limit. And I think that there's this kind of expectation that you need to replace it with somebody else that looks like that, that's maybe got a few years before they're going to retire. I guess back to that point around diversity, there's such a broad range of people you can bring into an advisory board to give you insight into your end markets. Now, if it is exit strategy, exit focus planning, that's probably more of an industry advisor, or probably more of an entrepreneur. And you can manage that transition in loads of different ways. It might be that individual that's already on the board becomes the chair, becomes the chairperson, because they know loads about the business, they're very experienced, they've got the ability to do that. People who might be less experienced joining the board, but have a lot of knowledge and experience to add. That experienced person who's sort of on the way out can really sort of facilitate a more effective board. So you can almost create a role for everybody in that without overburdening it. Obviously, you've got to keep an eye on costs in that regard. But if you've already got a structure where there's a NED involved, then you should be able to facilitate some kind of transition there. But I'd say that is probably the most common. It's, you know, at that kind of really early founder stage, it's a friend of a friend, or, you know, it's the dad's friend who used to be a banker, and they definitely add a ton of value. But, you know, have they got their finger on the pulse in terms of the end market, and also, you know, what you need to do to sell your business? Probably not, but they can definitely have a lot of governance. So there's a huge amount of value in it. But I think, like I say, it's just thinking outside the box in terms of people to attract.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there are no further questions,